Hi everyone, coming back with another lecture, brief lecture, on rhetoric. I'm Adam Ellwanger, Associate Professor of English at University of Houston downtown. And this is primarily for my students in English 5317, Rhetorical Theory and Criticism. We talked a little bit last week about some rhetorical terminology, the vocabulary that you need to master to be able to enter into an analysis of rhetoric. Many of these terms are terms for things that you are already intuitively familiar with, about how persuasion works, about how argument works, but you may not know that they have a word that designates that particular thing that you understood intuitively about argumentation. So let's get started, because rhetoric never sleeps. Seriously, remember that. Actually, write that down. That's pretty good. I'll wait. You might not even have a notebook in front of you while you're doing this. You should. Go get a notebook, because I'm going to drop a lot of gems like that. Alright. Okay, let's get going. So, I don't think in class we talked about this question of what rhetoric does. And there's a 2,500-year-old debate about the relationship between rhetoric and truth. Some people are very skeptical of rhetoric, or take a cynical view that rhetoric really doesn't have much at all to do with truth. This was the position taken by Plato and, to a lesser extent, Aristotle, but it continues to this day, and the idea that rhetoric doesn't have much to do with truth is probably why the word rhetoric has a negative connotation still, where people say, that's just rhetoric, or that's just empty rhetoric. Well, in this debate about whether or not rhetoric is related to truth, there's really two important terms that you need to know. One is episteme. These are Greek terms, and what that means, our word epistemological comes from this word, and epistemology, of course, is the study of knowledge. Episteme is knowledge, or truth, and some people would hold that rhetoric can assist us in getting to truth. In other words, the use of rhetoric can reveal truths that exist outside of rhetoric itself, much in the same way that science can help unveil some truths about the physical world. There are some theorists who think that rhetoric can play a similar role, that rhetoric can help us understand truth. And then there's a competing conception of rhetoric that says that rhetoric really doesn't deal in truth, that what rhetoric does is just kind of manipulate people's beliefs. In other words, it creates the appearance of truth. It makes things look true and worthy of credence. The Greek word pistis means belief, and this is the essence of the Platonic criticism of rhetoric, that all rhetoric does is manipulate people's beliefs. And so in that sense, it's kind of self-centered, right? It's a way that speakers or people who use rhetoric try to control other people. And by the Platonic idea, that's bad for society at large, right? Now there's a related term called Doxa, or sometimes endoxa, with an en in front of the word. And this means something like public opinion. And in the political uses of rhetoric, doxa is an important concept, because persuading the public of things, in other words, political engagement, depends not so much on truth, but on what the public believes to be true, public opinion. An example of this would be, the idea of Russian collusion with the Trump 2016 campaign and the Russian government. We know that that investigation seems to be in part politically motivated, and Trump's opponents did a very good job of making the public believe that there was probably some relationship between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And so, despite the fact that there's still zero evidence that Trump colluded with Russia to try to win the election, it doesn't really matter ultimately whether or not it's true that there was collusion. Because a large part of the population believes there was collusion, and that's really all that matters. That's how Doxa works. This is one of the interesting things about rhetoric, that what people believe to be true is at least as powerful in terms of rhetorical engagement as what is true. And so this question of the relationship between rhetoric and truth, episteme, pistis, doxa, these are all ideas that we need to consider as we observe how rhetoric works in real-world contexts. Okay, so this is closely related, we were talking about public opinion, to two other terms you should know. One is the polis. The polis. This was the Greek word for a city-state, right? But what it really means is sort of the state or the political structure at large, right? The political entity, the state. And so obviously rhetoric plays an important role, especially in democratic governance, of how the state is run. And so there's an inherent relationship between rhetoric and the state or the polis. Today when we use the word polis, obviously we don't have city-states anymore, but if we were going to use it in rhetorical terms, we would probably mean something like the national consciousness, the polis, or maybe even at the state or city level, right? That's really what it means. Like if we say Annapolis, right? Minneapolis, the polis means city. Connected to polis is the demos. And what the demos are the people who inhabit the polis. Obviously, Greek democracy was very restrictive in who actually had any power in the Greek city-state. But in a democracy like ours, where in theory all citizens have a right to vote, this kind of things, or that kind of thing, the demos is much more expansive. And I mean, it's a valid question as to whether or not democracy is even a functional system of government for a nation of 350 million people, right? This is a system of government that was devised to govern a very small population. But that's a political, philosophical question. So the demos and the polis, obviously doxa plays an important role in relation to these things. So let's move on to another kind of debate, and that's a debate about what rhetoric is as an art, or as a practice that is undertaken. So two words for you to know here. Techne and Hexxus. So let's start with techne. You might know that the sophists were a group in ancient Greece who kind of sold their services in the teaching of rhetoric. And they insisted that rhetoric was an art or a particular field of knowledge. In other words, it was something discrete, like psychology or biology or mathematics, a field in which there's actually knowledge to be learned that can be applied. And when we say rhetoric is a techne, that's what we mean, that it's a field of knowledge with concrete principles that can be learned and studied, that can be deployed in real-world practice. And this is kind of a positive notion of rhetoric, because it asserts the validity of rhetoric as a discrete field of knowledge. But again, like on the Platonic register, the criticism of rhetoric holds that it's more like a Hexxus, right? That Plato calls rhetoric, or the rhetoric of sophists, just a knack. Or basically just a skill that some people have and some people don't. That rhetoric, some people are just good at arguing, right? And so the idea here is that rhetoric is kind of empty as a field of knowledge, that there's nothing really to be learned, that some people are very good persuaders or very good at argumentation without ever having studied rhetoric. You know, and so by this idea, there's really nothing to be learned. It's just something that some people have and some people don't. So that's kind of a negative view of rhetoric, is that it's just kind of a habit that some people have, or a knack. Now, in my opinion, there's probably a little bit to both of these, right? I think some people do have a knack for argumentation or persuasion. And those people never really have to study. However, I think that especially those people, if they learn certain rhetorical principles, they can actually exponentially increase their power to persuade or their skill in negotiating rhetorical situations. And so it's probably a mix of these things. Okay. Now, Hexxus is also a term as habit that relates to rhetorical pedagogy, or learning and teaching of rhetoric. Because when you argue, like when you're in an argument face to face, there's not a lot of time to sit back and think, geez, what principle can I apply at this moment to persuade this person I'm arguing with? It's more extemporaneous than that. It's more imminent than that. You don't have a lot of time to think about what's the best claim to advance here. And this is where rhetorical training comes in, right? It's kind of like sparring. When maybe you have a friend who you just argue with for kicks, like just to you know, kind of rhetorical play, just trying to see who can convince each other best, that kind of thing, right? That kind of training establishes habits, or Hexxus, right? That then can inform real-world encounters that relate to rhetoric. And so there's a book by Deb Hawkey, Bodily Arts, and in that she talks about certain parallels between wrestling or martial arts and learning to fight in ancient Greece and learning to make use of the art of rhetoric. And one of the things that she talks about is that they both depend on a repetition. Getting good at either of those skills depends on a repetition, and it's through the repetition that the habit is constructed. And so a good example of this might be, you know, early Mike Tyson fights, where if you remember, like back in the, some of you are too young to remember, but in the early 80s or the mid 80s, when Mike Tyson was just the presence in boxing, he had this uppercut, and once he deployed that uppercut, it was over every time. You know, these fights would last like 90 seconds. They'd be built up, and people would be anticipating them. They'd be over in a minute and a half. And that was because, in part, Mike Tyson had refined this habit, right? Particularly in relation to that uppercut. And when the moment for that uppercut came, he didn't think, oh, there it is, there's the time, now, throw it now, right? The hit just went, right? It was a reflex. And, you know, how you establish reflexes is through a kind of repetitive training that is really inculcation of habit. Now, it's interesting that we just talked about the moment, right? Especially in relation to the Tyson fights, that moment for the uppercut. And this brings in another term that we need to speak of, Kairos, right? There's a lot of different theoretical accounts of what Kairos is, and some of them, you know, vary to a high degree from other ones, right? So there's, you know, not total consensus on exactly what this term means as it relates to rhetoric. But in the most basic sense, Kairos relates to rhetorical timing, right? A sense of timing, and a particular relation to the moment that is ripe for persuasion. And so this, even teenagers and children have an innate sense of Kairos. So if you ever, when you were a kid, waited to ask something from your mother or father until you observed them in a good mood, that's you utilizing a kind of sense of Kairos, knowing that now isn't the right time to ask for this. And so, Kairos is kind of coming to recognize the moment. But it's also, I think in a higher theoretical level, an ability to construct the moment, to build the moment. Not simply to recognize it when it comes, but to bring about the right moment for sort of rhetorical engagement. And again, the ability to create the moment is in some degree dependent on Hexxus, habits, right? And techne, knowing basic principles about how rhetoric operates. And we'll talk about some of those as our study rolls on. Okay, so I'm going to erase these. Make sure, that for our next class you've learned these, or at least the basic definitions of them, because it'll be important as we begin to do rhetorical analyses from a theoretical orientation. Last couple things I want to talk about are the 5 canons of rhetoric. Again, not like guns, but canons, groups, right? This is, this goes back quite a ways in rhetorical theory, but the traditional idea is that there's 5 canons, that is 5 steps in producing a piece of rhetoric. And the first of these is invention. In other words, anytime you're going to give a speech or try to persuade someone of something, the first step is think about what you're going to say or what arguments you're going to make, right? And coming up with those arguments and those appeals is the step of invention. Of course, it can be a lot more complicated than that if we get into sort of more expansive theoretical conversations of invention. But for now, that's what it is. It's coming up with the stuff that you're going to say. Second one is arrangement. And this is organizational, right? Organizational considerations. If you're writing a paper, I hope there's a point at which you say, all right, so how am I going to structure this argument? What order am I going to make my points in? What work needs to be done before I can get to the part where I approach this particular consideration of the argument? Those kinds of things. So this is where you arrange the material or organize the material that you generated or invented. Third is style, right? So this relates to, invention relates to what you're going to say. Arrangement kind of relates to when you're going to say it. Style relates to how are you going to say it. And you've probably been in a situation where you were fine with what was said, but the problem was how someone said it. Something bothered you about how it was said. Not what was said, but how it was said. And that shows how important style is to persuasion. And of course, something like the question of voice in writing is also a stylistic consideration. So style is very important. And associated with it is another term, Greek term called Hexxus. It's an easy term to remember because fancy car is Lexus. Lexus means style. So just bear that term in mind. The fourth and the fifth canons are memory and delivery. I segment these off here because they seem somewhat foreign to us. We're largely a textual society, and so the idea that you need to memorize your argument, right, is somewhat remote from the way that we interact with one another. These are artifacts of an oral society, right, where there weren't high rates of literacy, and that most traditional examples of rhetoric were deployed in a moment, in a verbal context, in front of an audience that wouldn't be recorded or anything like that. And so you didn't have to remember the argument. Of course, delivery also sort of has that echo of an oral culture in it. But delivery obviously is important for us today too, you know, in terms of things like gesture, pace, volume, eye contact, all of these different considerations of how you present something. So those are the 5 canons of rhetoric, 5 steps to producing, you know, a rhetorical artifact. And the last thing that I want to talk about right now is the topoi, what Aristotle calls the topoi. And what that literally means, like the word topoi means the places. And so loosely put, the topoi are common places that common intellectual places that you can go to produce an argument. And so another way to put it really simply is common lines of argument. Lines of argument that can be used for a lot of different contexts and purposes. The singular of topoi, so topoi is plural, but the singular is topic, right? And again, that just means a place. Like when you read a medicine that says for topical use only, they mean it's only for use on a particular place on your skin or whatever, right? In the Latin vocabulary, this is loci, or locus, locality, place, right? So let me give an example of a topoi. A basic line of argument might be the bigger and the smaller, right? And so, you know, there's a lot of different types of arguments where a distinction between bigger and smaller can be helpful to your persuasion, right? It can relate to economic arguments about bigger and smaller sums of money. It can relate to health arguments, bigger and smaller people. It can relate to crime, right? Larger crimes and smaller crimes. So basically the idea to topoi is that through sort of rhetorical training, you can consider and generate a number of topics or topoi that you kind of have in a rhetorical Rolodex in your head, so that when you're in the moment, right, in a rhetorical exchange, you've got a lot of little ready-made arguments up here that you can go to, the common places intellectually that you can go to win the argument. So this is really linked in important ways to invention, right? Because sometimes when we're face-to-face arguing, there's not a lot of time to invent. There's not a lot of time to sit back and think, well, what are the available means of persuasion here? What you have to rely on is something like topoi, ready-made lines of argument that can be deployed in a number of different situations. And when we read Aristotle's book on rhetoric, he offers a number of different topoi besides the one example that I just gave you. So I think that's it for this afternoon. This again complements some of the discussion of rhetorical vocabulary that we did in class face-to-face last week. If you've got questions about this stuff, you can either send me a question in the comment section of this video, and I can try to answer it, or if you're actually in my class, the University of Houston downtown, just post it on the discussion board, and I'll be happy to get back to you. It's a long weekend. Martin Luther King Day is Monday. Take a breather, because once we get back from the break, we're going to hit the books hard. Have a good day.